It was supposed to be a routine day, a business trip, the same as every other. I didn't care much for my job, but it paid the bills, and maybe I had come to rely on that monotony. Each time I packed my bags, I'd feel the familiar tug of reluctance, forcing myself to go for the sake of keeping things steady. My wife, Sarah, was the opposite. Where I felt weary of the work, she'd encourage me, telling me I was the one holding it all together. She'd joke that I was her own reluctant hero, and I'd laugh, just about convinced I had some purpose that made these trips worthwhile. But today, something felt off, just a trace of something different in the air. As I packed, Sarah lingered nearby, as she often did, teasing me gently about my grumbling, the way I'd slow my pace until she'd finally have to nudge me out the door. I guess our mornings had developed into a sort of tradition. We joked around a lot. Our shared humor was something that had always kept us close. It was a lightness between us that I was grateful for, especially on days like this when I really needed that push to get out the door. Today, though, as I was zipping up my suitcase, she leaned against the counter, grinning with a bit of mischief in her eyes. "Don't worry about me," she said, laughing softly. "As soon as you leave, I'll bring my secret lover over." It was the kind of joke we'd thrown around 100 times before, and I knew she was only kidding. I laughed, rolling my eyes at her, and shot back, "Well, he better treat you right." She laughed too, brushing it off, and soon enough, I was on my way, thinking nothing of it. As I drove, a part of me felt an odd sense of calm, a warmth spreading as I thought about her and our life together. Our marriage was solid, or at least I had thought it was. I felt lucky that after all these years, she and I still had this playfulness. It seemed like a rare thing these days, and as I pulled out onto the main road, I thought about how grateful I was to have a wife like her. It was a long day of travel, connecting flights and heavy traffic, but I finally checked into my hotel by early evening. The first thing I did, as always, was call Sarah. I wanted to hear her voice, and in the back of my mind, I felt that familiar comfort at the thought of her answering right away. Except this time she didn't. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, enough that I felt a hint of worry prickling at me. Sarah always picked up right away. She always knew when I was calling, so this was strange. When she did pick up on the second call, she sounded fine, laughing a little and apologizing for missing the first one. She brushed it off, saying she'd been in the kitchen, but something felt off. Maybe it was just that nagging feeling I'd had that morning, but as I told her about my trip, I felt the urge to really listen, to pick up on anything unusual. We fell into our usual rhythm, her teasing me about the hassle of travel, me complaining about the coffee at the hotel. The back and forth felt normal, and I began to relax, shrugging off that small unease. We talked for a good half hour about everything and nothing. She told me what she'd had for lunch, what our neighbors were up to, little things that kept me grounded and reminded me of home. It was as though we were still sitting across from each other, our feet brushing under the table in the morning quiet. But eventually, I could feel the long day wearing on me. I told her I'd better get some sleep since I'd have to be up early, and she laughed, telling me not to overdo it. After we hung up, I lay there in the unfamiliar bed, but sleep didn't come as easily as I'd hoped. Maybe it was the fact that Sarah had missed that first call, something she'd almost never done, or maybe it was just the distance between us, an odd sort of silence in the room now that I was alone. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Sarah was there, waiting for me to get home in a few days, just like she always was. But that one little thing, her not picking up the first time, kept replaying in my mind, nagging at me even as I drifted off. I told myself it was just a bad habit, a worry without a reason, and finally I slept. The following morning, I woke up earlier than planned. It was still dark outside, the kind of stillness that makes everything feel heavier, like it's weighing down on you. I had slept poorly, turning over the odd feeling from the night before in my mind. I told myself it was just residual worry, nothing to be concerned about. Still, I couldn't shake it. I was getting ready to head out for the first meeting of the day when I remembered I'd forgotten to send some files to my boss the night before. I knew I'd have to ask Brian, my best friend, to do me a favor and send them. He'd always been the dependable type, always had my back, and I knew he'd understand. So, I reached for my phone and dialed his number. The line rang longer than expected. Brian wasn't the kind of person to leave you hanging, especially when it was me calling. He always picked up within the first ring or two. This time, however, it kept ringing unanswered. I felt the start of another strange feeling creeping up, like something was just out of place, a wrong note in a song I couldn't ignore. I tried to push it aside as I waited for him to pick up. Finally, he answered, sounding a little out of breath, like he'd just rushed to grab the phone. I jumped right in, explaining that I needed him to send some files from my desktop back at home. He agreed, and as we talked, I felt a bit of the morning tension ease. But then, in the middle of our conversation, I heard it, the unmistakable squeak of my garage door. Now, this wasn't just any ordinary door sound. I'd installed a specific alarm system on the garage door, and I knew that sound as well as I knew my own voice. A high-pitched squeak followed by a click as the sensor reconnected. I froze mid-sentence, the air in my lungs feeling cold. The sound was clear, undeniable. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it, to explain it away as some bizarre coincidence. But then I heard another sound, fainter but unmistakable. My wife's voice, muffled but familiar. I couldn't process it at first. I'd called Brian's phone, hadn't I? And Brian had answered from his place, hadn't he? Maybe he was... No, there was no reason for him to be at my house at that hour. The pieces didn't fit together, and I found myself struggling, grasping for an explanation that would make this anything other than what it seemed. But my heart was already dropping, a nauseating realization settling in the pit of my stomach. Still, I tried. I asked him casually where he was, hoping, in some absurd way, that he'd say he was at home and this would all make sense. But Brian, my best friend, just told me he was indeed at home, his voice calm and sure, as if nothing was amiss. The reality hit me harder than I could have expected. My mind raced back to all the small moments, the times my wife had seemed distant, her texts short, the nights she'd been busy whenever I called. The pieces began to form a picture I couldn't unsee. This wasn't just a suspicion anymore. It was something real, something happening right in my own home, and it was as if the world around me had shifted, dropping me into some cruel, alternate reality where nothing was as I thought it was. I didn't let on that I'd heard anything. I finished the conversation with Brian, pretending I was in a rush. The whole time, my voice was steady, but inside, I felt like I was falling through some void, watching as everything I'd believed about my marriage, my friendship, came crashing down around me. The second the call ended, I threw everything into my bag with a single focus. I was going home. I couldn't think, couldn't reason. All I could feel was a surge of anger and disbelief that seemed to fuel every movement, every rush step as I gathered my things and left the hotel. The drive home was a blur. I'd barely registered the world outside, passing by at speeds that were anything but safe. All I could see in my mind's eye was that garage door opening, Brian inside my house, my wife's voice echoing faintly in the background. Every mile closer to home, the anger grew hotter, sharper, cutting into me with each reminder that I was racing toward a confrontation that I couldn't fully predict. A part of me knew I needed to prepare, to think through what I would do or say, but the anger blotted out everything else, filling my mind with a single demand. Get there, see it for yourself. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, replaying all those small, unsettling moments in the past few months. The time Sarah had brushed off my calls, the way she'd laughed off her own joke about inviting her lover over as soon as I left. It all began to make sense, each small oddity adding up to something far bigger, something I had been too trusting, too blinded by loyalty to notice before. My mind reeled with questions, things I wanted to ask, but already knew there'd be no satisfying answer for. How long had this been going on? How could I have been so blind to it? And worst of all, why him? Brian, of all people. My best friend, someone I confided in, trusted more than anyone. The betrayal hit on every level, searing into my thoughts with a rage that felt uncontainable. The drive back felt like a fever blur. Every mile closer to home only fueled the anger I was holding back, burning through every thought as I tried to wrap my head around what I was about to face. I called Sarah several times, hoping, maybe foolishly, that she'd pick up and somehow explain this all away. But there was nothing, just the endless ringing on the other end, each unanswered call tightening the knot in my chest. I couldn't even think about what I'd say. I just needed to see her face, to hear her explain herself directly. Then, after nearly half an hour of no response, my phone buzzed. Sarah's name flashed across the screen. I gripped the phone tightly, barely able to keep my voice steady as I answered. She sounded casual, like it was any other day, apologizing for not picking up and telling me she'd been busy. Busy with what? I asked. Her answer threw me. She was mowing the lawn, she said. Mowing the lawn? I gripped the steering wheel, barely able to believe what I was hearing. I had mowed it less than a week ago, and besides, she'd never been one to handle those kinds of chores. My pulse quickened. Her story only deepened the suspicion gnawing at me. Every word felt like another piece sliding into place, confirming the worst of what I had imagined. But I played along. I told her I'd be busy all day, not reachable, and her response was as casual as I could have expected. Take care, as if nothing unusual was happening at all. After that call, the drive took on a different pace. I pushed harder, faster, the miles flying by in a haze. I ignored speed limits, stop signs, every little rule that normally kept me in line. None of it mattered at that moment. All I could think about was getting home, confronting whatever was going on, and facing the truth head-on. There was no escaping it now. When I finally pulled into our neighborhood, the sight that greeted me was like a punch to the gut. Brian's car, parked right in front of my house, as if it belonged there. Seeing it there, bold as anything, was enough to send a fresh surge of anger coursing through me. I barely had the patience to pull over, the sight only fueling the fire already raging inside me. I made my way to the door, reaching for my keys only to find it locked. Another small but telling detail. I hadn't left it that way, and Sarah was never one to lock the door during the day. I didn't hesitate. I had my master key, so I unlocked it and stepped inside. The silence that greeted me was unsettling, too calm, too ordinary, and I could feel the anger bubbling up, threatening to boil over as I took each step toward the stairs. I reached the bedroom door, my heart pounding as I pushed it open. The scene inside was a cruel confirmation of everything I had feared. There, on the bed we shared, were Sarah and Brian. They were lying together, wrapped in each other's arms, seemingly oblivious to everything until the door crashed open. In that instant, the anger, the disbelief, the betrayal, all of it flooded through me, and before I could think, I was shouting, the words raw and bitter as they left my mouth. Sarah's face turned pale, her expression frozen in a mixture of fear and guilt. Brian, too, seemed at a loss, stammering something about explaining everything, his words tripping over themselves in an attempt to reach me. But I wasn't listening. I couldn't hear anything they said. All I could see was the betrayal, the scene that had shattered every illusion I'd held, standing there in front of me like a twisted caricature of everything I thought I knew. I felt the need to release the fury somehow, my hand reaching instinctively for the vase on the dresser. Without thinking, I hurled it at the wall, the sound of it shattering echoing through the room. It was a small thing, a futile gesture against the storm raging inside me, but it was all I could do to keep myself grounded, to keep from breaking down entirely. Sarah barely reacted, just sat there, stunned, as if she couldn't process what had just happened. The sight of them together, my wife and my best friend, left me reeling, trapped between fury and disbelief. As I stood there, the anger dulled, and I felt something else entirely, a strange, hollow emptiness. I looked at Sarah, hoping maybe she'd have some reaction, something that would make sense of what I'd just witnessed. But she just sat there, looking shocked, her face pale and drained, like she was somewhere far away. Slowly, her expression began to crumble, her eyes glistening as tears pooled. She looked at me, then down at her hands, barely able to meet my gaze. She opened her mouth, her voice barely a whisper, almost as if she were talking to herself. "I'm sorry," she said. "I was so stupid, and I can't believe what I've done." Her words hung in the air, empty and hollow, barely reaching me. She looked away, shaking her head, and then, as if making a last confession, she continued, I went out with Brian because I liked him. She paused, her eyes downcast, unable to face me fully. But now, I don't even know why. I don't feel anything anymore. I stood there, unable to process what I was hearing. The words sounded like excuses, like fragments from a scene I was meant to believe, but I couldn't wrap my mind around it. The betrayal, the months of doubt I had ignored, the way she had pushed me to take these trips, all of it crashed down on me, and I couldn't bear to stay there a moment longer. I felt the rage well up again, my voice trembling as I finally let it out. I told her, loudly and clearly, that when I returned, I didn't want to see a trace of her left in my home. The words came out sharper than I intended, but there was no going back. I demanded that by the evening, both she and her belongings be gone. She didn't try to argue, didn't even try to fight. She simply nodded, looking down at her hands, as if some weight she hadn't expected was pressing down on her. Unable to bear the sight of her any longer, I turned and left the room, the echo of her silence following me down the stairs and out the door. The air outside felt colder, sharper, as if the whole world had shifted. I could barely breathe, my chest tight as I stumbled to my car, not entirely sure where I was going, but knowing I had to get away, to clear my mind before it tore me apart. I slammed the door shut, started the engine, and drove off, leaving the house and everything in it behind. As I drove, my thoughts churned. My mind kept circling back to Sarah, to all the moments we'd shared, now tainted by what I'd just seen. The pain was unbearable, yet a small part of me felt relieved that I finally knew the truth. The months of suspicion, the fleeting doubts I'd tried to push away, they all came rushing back now, clearer than ever. Eventually, I found myself heading toward Lisa's place. Lisa was Sarah's sister, but she'd always been something else to me, something more. We had developed a closeness over time, a quiet understanding that went beyond words. She had been there for me during other rough patches in life, and I had always turned to her when things felt unbearable. But this was different. This wasn't just another rough patch. This was my life unraveling, and I didn't know where else to turn. When I reached her place, she opened the door, her eyes wide with surprise. I must have looked a mess because the shock on her face said everything. She ushered me inside, and without hesitating, I told her everything that had happened. The words tumbled out of me, a blur of anger and pain, each sentence feeling like a weight lifted even as it left me raw and exposed. Lisa sat quietly, listening to every word, her face a mix of sympathy and something else I couldn't quite place. When I finished, she reached out, her hand resting on my arm, her voice gentle and calm. "This will be good for us," she said softly. "We can finally be closer now." Her words lingered, and in that moment, a rush of conflicting emotions hit me. She was right. We had been close for a long time, but always on the fringes, never quite letting the truth settle between us. Lisa had been my confidant, my escape. Through everything, she had been there, a steady presence that understood me in ways no one else could. But this time it was different. This time, I wasn't just seeking comfort. I was confronting the reality that had always been between us, simmering quietly beneath the surface. She leaned in, her warmth a welcome contrast to the cold anger I'd been carrying since the morning. Her presence was calming, grounding me in a way I desperately needed. In that moment, it was as if everything else faded. The betrayal, the pain, even the anger. It was just Lisa and me, two people finding solace in each other's company, filling the empty spaces left by those who should have been there for us. As the hours passed, I found myself relaxing for the first time all day. Lisa didn't pry or ask questions, didn't demand anything of me. She simply sat beside me, offering a quiet support that felt more. After pouring my heart out to Lisa, I felt a weight lift. Somehow, being around her dulled the sharp edges of everything that had just happened. She was warm, understanding, and didn't flinch at anything I said. She knew the pain of betrayal too, in her own way. Being there with her felt like a strange, kind of homecoming, a place where I didn't have to explain myself or pretend everything was fine. I didn't know if it was the long drive, the exhaustion of the day, or just the weight of it all, but I felt myself sinking deeper into that calm, letting it envelop me. Lisa was there, offering a comfort I hadn't realized I'd been craving. One thing led to another, and soon, we were lying together, our inhibitions falling away with the hours. There was no room for hesitation. It felt as natural as anything else in my life. I hadn't expected this, hadn't planned for it. But the rush of relief, of being with someone who seemed to care so deeply, was more powerful than any doubts. All the rage and betrayal seemed to dissipate, replaced by a quiet kind of warmth that I hadn't felt in so long. As we lay there together, everything else felt like it had faded into the background. For once, I wasn't thinking about what my wife had done or what I'd seen in my own home. In some way, I even felt grateful that things had finally come to light. I realized I'd been holding on to something that no longer existed, something that had slipped away a long time ago. Now, in that quiet moment, I could finally let it go, at least for a little while. But the peace didn't last. A sound broke through the calm, a door opening, footsteps in the hallway. Lisa and I looked at each other, a flash of alarm in both our eyes. I scrambled to find my clothes, a panic setting in that I couldn't quite understand until I realized who it must be. As soon as the door swung open, I saw her standing there, my wife, her face twisted in shock as she took in the scene before her. She looked at us, at me, her eyes narrowing as the weight of what she was seeing dawned on her. She was shaking, a mix of anger and disbelief coloring her expression. "So, this is where you went," she spat, her voice laced with bitterness. Her gaze shifted from me to Lisa, then back again, as though she couldn't decide which of us to address first. The fury in her eyes was like nothing I'd seen before. It was almost as though she'd discovered some betrayal that she hadn't anticipated. It was an irony I didn't miss, given what I'd just walked in on hours before. The three of us stood in silence for a moment, none of us knowing what to say, the weight of our choices pressing down in the room. Then Sarah's anger erupted. She lashed out, her words sharp, accusing, as though she was somehow the one who'd been wronged. I tried to keep my voice steady, to explain myself, but there was no reasoning with her. The shock and betrayal I'd seen earlier were now reflected back at me, and it was as if we were trapped in a loop of blame and bitterness, each accusing the other without realizing we'd both played a role in this unraveling. In a fit of rage, Sarah turned and spotted a large chandelier hanging from the ceiling, one that Lisa had won in some tournament and had always cherished. Before I could stop her, she grabbed something, a shoe, a book, I wasn't even sure, and hurled it upward, shattering the glass dome with a crash that echoed through the house. Glass shards scattered across the floor, glinting in the light, and I could see Lisa's face twist with a fury I hadn't expected. Lisa stepped forward, her own anger igniting as she yelled at Sarah, telling her to get out, to leave her house immediately. Her voice was cold, unyielding, and there was no trace of the calm, understanding Lisa I'd been with just moments before. This was a different side of her, one I'd never seen but could feel with every word she threw at Sarah. She ordered her out, her voice shaking as she pointed to the door, saying things that even I wouldn't have dared. For a moment, I thought Sarah would argue, that she'd try to retaliate, but even she seemed taken aback by the fierceness in Lisa's tone. She stood there, stunned, a bitterness in her expression as she looked from me to Lisa and back again. But she didn't argue. She just gave one last look, her eyes narrowing, as though committing this moment to memory, and then she stormed out, slamming the door behind her. I heard the distant sound of glass crunching under her feet, followed by the harsh scrape of metal as she brushed against my car on her way out. The sound of her footsteps faded, leaving an uneasy silence in their wake. I looked at Lisa, both of us standing amid the chaos left behind, broken glass, torn emotions, and the weight of what had just happened. I could see the anger still flickering in her eyes, but as we stood there, that fierce expression softened, and she looked at me with something closer to sorrow, a shared understanding of everything we'd just lost and found. I didn't know what lay ahead, didn't know how we'd navigate the aftermath of this tangled mess, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. Outside, I knew Sarah had nowhere to go. She couldn't go to Brian. He had a family, a life he'd risked too much to jeopardize by letting her back in. She and Lisa wouldn't be talking anytime soon, and as for me, I knew she wouldn't be coming back. The damage was done, and there was no going back from where we'd all found ourselves. As the dust settled and silence filled the house once more, I realized that everything had changed in ways none of us could have anticipated. We were left with broken pieces of trust, of family, of friendships, and only time would tell what, if anything, could be rebuilt. The month following that confrontation was a strange mix of upheaval and relief. I'd left behind the pieces of a broken marriage and a shattered trust in my best friend, but somehow, through the turmoil, I'd found something new with Lisa. My ex-wife's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also lifted a weight I didn't realize I'd been carrying. I felt, in an odd way, liberated, free from a life that had been simmering with silent doubt and unacknowledged issues. The fact that it was Lisa, Sarah's own sister, who had helped me through it added a layer of complexity, yet it also gave me a sense of grounding. She understood in ways no one else could. Lisa and I had spent those initial days in a sort of suspended time, processing everything that had happened and figuring out what it meant for us. We had more in common than I had ever realized, and that connection grew into something real. As the days passed, I felt my life settling into a different rhythm. We didn't rush things, but our bond deepened with each conversation, each moment of understanding that only she could provide. And then, only a few weeks after that fateful day, Lisa told me something that changed everything. She was pregnant. The news was like a light breaking through the fog. It was unexpected, but instead of panic, I felt a sense of purpose and direction that I hadn't experienced in a long time. The baby, our child, gave us a reason to truly start fresh. We talked for hours about what we wanted, both for ourselves and for the life we were bringing into the world. After some thought, we decided to leave behind the place that held so many memories, both good and painful. It felt like the right choice, a way to create a life together on our own terms, without the shadow of past betrayals lingering over us. So we made the leap. We sold our respective houses and found a quiet town where nobody knew us. It was the perfect escape from everything we had been through, a place where we could start over with a sense of peace. The move was tiring, but fulfilling. Each box we unpacked felt like a step toward a new life, one that we could build from scratch. In those early weeks, we were busy adjusting to this new reality. We learned things about each other that we'd never known before, quirks and habits that only come out when you're truly living with someone. Lisa was patient, supportive, and thoughtful in ways that surprised me. She brought out a side of me I hadn't known existed. We spent our days planning for the baby, discussing dreams and hopes, and for the first time in a long while I felt like I had a future worth investing in. Meanwhile, life for Sarah and Brian had taken a different turn. Rumors began to filter back to us, stories from mutual friends and whispers that reached our new town. Brian's life had fallen apart in the wake of everything. His family had learned of the affair, and it didn't take long before they left him, taking their children with them. He now lived alone, the once lively home he had built now a quiet, empty reminder of his mistakes. I'd be lying if I said there wasn't some satisfaction in that knowledge. It felt like a form of justice, a consequence that he had brought upon himself. But it was also tinged with a strange sadness, a reminder of how quickly things could unravel when trust was broken. Sarah, however, had taken an even darker path. From what I'd heard, she had drifted aimlessly, seemingly unable to find any stability after everything had come to light. She was drinking heavily, barely keeping herself together, and according to some, she didn't have a stable place to stay. It was rumored she'd been spending nights at a train station, with nowhere else to go. I hadn't expected this turn of events, hadn't wanted it if I were honest. Despite everything, I didn't relish seeing her life fall apart in this way. But there was a certain inevitability to it, a result of choices she'd made without considering the consequences. Another few months passed, and my focus shifted fully to the future I was building with Lisa. We had decided to start a business together, something that would allow us to work from home and support our new life. It took long hours, planning, and a lot of late nights, but it became our shared project, something that drew us even closer together. Lisa had a knack for the details, handling things I would have overlooked while I managed the bigger picture. The business began to thrive, growing faster than we could have hoped, and each small success felt like a victory for both of us. The feeling of achievement, of working towards something that was truly ours, filled every day with purpose. Despite the rumors about Sarah, I hadn't heard from her directly since I'd left. But eventually, she did reach out in a way I didn't expect. She began leaving messages, sometimes pleading, sometimes apologizing, asking for forgiveness and saying she wanted to come back. Each message felt surreal, as if she were reaching from a past that no longer existed. At first, I ignored them, knowing there was no point in revisiting what was gone. But the messages continued, becoming more insistent, her words more desperate. She apologized, saying she'd made a mistake, that she realized now what she'd lost. She even went so far as to file a false report against me, an attempt to create trouble in my new life, to pull me back into the chaos she was living. But I wasn't the same person I had been before. I didn't respond, didn't give her the reaction she was looking for. I had moved on, had found something better and healthier than anything I'd known before. It was strange, almost surreal, how quickly my perspective had changed. The betrayal that once consumed me now felt distant, like something that had happened to someone else. I could see the ways it had led me to a better place, a stronger relationship, and a future I could actually look forward to. I had built something real with Lisa, and each day only solidified my certainty that everything had unfolded the way it was meant to. As I looked around our new home, at the life we had created, I felt a strange sense of gratitude for everything that had happened. The betrayal, as painful as it had been, had set me on a path I wouldn't have found otherwise. It had given me clarity, had forced me to confront parts of my life that weren't working, even if I hadn't wanted to admit it at the time. Now, I was with someone who truly valued me, who had supported me through the darkest times and shown me a love that was genuine, without the complications and betrayals of the past. Looking back, I could see how much I had changed, how much Lisa had changed me. She had helped me heal, had given me a new perspective on what love and loyalty could be. Our business was thriving, and with the baby on the way, I had a purpose that went beyond anything I'd known before. I no longer felt haunted by Sarah's betrayal or Brian's lies. Instead, I felt a calm, a certainty that I was exactly where I needed to be. In the end, I was grateful, if you could believe it. Grateful that Sarah's betrayal had led me here, to a life that was richer, more fulfilling than anything I'd ever imagined. I no longer felt anger or resentment, only a quiet contentment that things had worked out for the best. I had found happiness, peace, and love with someone who truly understood me, and I knew that was something worth holding on to.